Here's the good news. We know something that is too good not to share. Jesus is in the business of making heaven on earth, right here, right now. And only together can we invite every generation to experience the love and grace of Jesus, which is making lives whole, making families strong, and making our community new. Right here, right now, and that's good news.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you. Did we ever figure out who's watching the 4th and 5th graders? We'll know in a few minutes. It's good to see you. 2,000 years ago, Jesus, he has his 12 guys. I mean, if you've read the stories, you kind of know. He's got these 12 guys that go everywhere with him. And typically they hang out in Nazareth, and they hang out around the Sea of Galilee, sort of where they're from. But one day, he takes these 12 guys way, way, way north of the city to this place called Caesarea Philippi. It was sort of like the Las Vegas of its day. I mean, it was just a place that because of what people did there, you never would have gone there if you were a good, sort of God-fearing Jewish Hebrew boy. But there Jesus is. He's got his 12 guys, and he looks at him. He says, hey guys, all this work that I've been doing, all the healing, all the powerful work of God that's been done through me, one day I'm not going to be around, and it's going to be you guys that are going to carry the torch forward into the world, and you're going to be the ones who do the work. And if you've read the stories in Matthew 16, Jesus and his followers, typically when Jesus says something, they don't know what he's talking about anyway. I mean, if you've ever read the Bible and you're like, I don't know what he's talking about, you're in really good company, because the disciples usually didn't know what Jesus was talking about either. But in this particular moment, I mean, there's sort of a, what are you talking about, boss? Kind of a moment. And Jesus essentially says in that moment, I'm going to do something called the church. I'm going to create something that is a assembly of people, and not through a person, and not through a building, and not through a set of practices, but through a people. I'm going to transform the world. And there was a guy named Peter there, who's one of the disciples. He's kind of like the lead guy of the band. He says, Peter, his name's Simon in that moment. He says, I'm going to call you Peter, which means rock. And on this rock, I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell are not going to overcome it, and you 12 guys are going to go and change the world. And we know from history, whether you're a Christian or not, it has been the church more than any other organization that has literally transformed the world. It was Christians who set up the first hospitals. It was Christians who began to bring and import ethics into our politics. It's Christians that began to transform education systems for the last 2,000 years. And the interesting thing to me, and I think this is very interesting about our world, that if you were to ask somebody, name an organization that's changing the world, nobody would say the church, would they? If I were to say, hey, what are some organizations that are changing the world? You would say Tesla is changing the world. You would say Uber is changing the world. You would say Google, Apple, Amazon, all great companies are changing the world. But here's sort of the heart of what we began to talk about last week. Not because, as leaders or because as a church, we're so great, but because this is what Jesus had in mind when he launched the church on that hillside in Caesarea Philippi. The Church of Jesus Christ in 2018 is still the best positioned organization in the world to transform the world. The Church of Jesus Christ that he decided was going to go into motion. And even when the disciples didn't understand it, the church remains the best positioned organization. The church is the greatest hope for the world. And people get this thing called the church wrong all the time. Some of us, you have scars from churches you grew up in or churches you used to go to. And churches certainly run by broken people. But the Church of Jesus Christ, when this thing called the church is firing on all cylinders, it remains the organization and the best equipped organization and institution to change and to transform the world. And so last week we began to talk about what does that mean for us. Now 2,000 years ago, when Jesus said church to Peter and Andrew and these guys, they had a sort of loose understanding of what church or what at least a religious organization should be. And so they were shocked, I'm sure, when Jesus said it's the church, it's a people moving forward into the world that's going to transform the world, because their understanding of church was essentially this. There was a sacred place. They understood church in terms of a temple in Jerusalem. There was a sacred, divine real estate in Jerusalem. This is the temple, what it would sort of look like. You can go to Jerusalem, and this is a model, sort of a mock-up of the first century city of Jerusalem. But you can see in comparison to other buildings how massive this infrastructure was. And this was literally, in Peter's mind, Andrew's mind, the disciples' mind, this was the house of God. We say that about the church often, well, it's the house of the Lord. But this was literally the house of God. It took 46 years to build. It was a massive sweeping structure. And the building in the middle, they believed that inside of that was the holiest of holies, and God literally dwelled inside of that temple. In fact, if you were not a Jew, if you were not a Hebrew, and you were just a Gentile, which is sort of the biblical word for all of us. You've never thought of yourself that way. You never put that on your DMV application. I'm a Gentile, you know. But that's what the Bible says. Anybody who's not a Jew or Hebrew could not go into the temple itself because it was so holy. It was such a sacred place. And so when Peter hears the church, I mean, his first thought has to be, a sacred place. Was there going to be a new sacred place? Is there going to be something that happens to the temple? That was his understanding, because that's literally where God lived. There wasn't just a sacred place, there was a sacred person. There was a sacred person. The sacred person, and this had been going on for 1,000 years since Moses. There was a high priest that came from a particular bloodline, and the high priest, the religious experience in the first century world was a pretty passive experience. If you were just a church-going person, if you were just a synagogue, temple-going person, it was the priest who did all the work. The priest on certain days of the year would offer the animal sacrifice on behalf of the people, and that was a forgiveness of sins. We don't have that system anymore, thank goodness. Jesus came and said, I'm the last sacrifice. There will be no more animal sacrifices, but that was the system. The priest did all the work. The high priest, if you've read the Easter story, you've read the Good Friday story, you know it was a man named Caiaphas at the time. Jesus was alive, was the high priest of Israel or Jerusalem. He was the highest moral authority that they had. So when Peter hears church, he's thinking, okay, sacred place, sacred person. There's a high priest, and that's just kind of the way church has gone for 1,000 years. There was also a set of sacred practices that the people would do. Sacred practices included animal sacrifices. That was the priest. That was what he did to make sure that the people were forgiven of their sins. If you were alive, or if I was a part of this system 2,000 years ago, you had the law. This was Leviticus. This is all that stuff in the Old Testament that you've read before, and you thought, why is this in here? All of that stuff, all the thou shalts from the Ten Commandments, that was your job. You committed yourself to the sacred practices. And so when Peter hears church, he understands church in terms of there's a sacred place, there's a sacred person, and there's a set of sacred practices that we are to perform and we are to do. And Jesus is essentially, when he launches the church, he says, Peter, guys, I'm not talking about any of that stuff. I'm not going to create a new sacred place and a new sacred person and a new set of sacred practices. It's now through a sacred people that I'm going to begin to do something incredible that the world has never seen, called the church. If you have a Bible, turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 2, and I want us to look at how Peter began to understand this. Now, he was on the hillside that day in Caesarea Philippi. He heard Jesus say this. In fact, he had the highest of the job responsibilities because he got the new name, and he was told, you're the rock, you're going to be the one that does this. But for the first 20 or so years of the church, there had to be a lot of questions, and there certainly were. When you read the book of Acts, when you read a lot of the letters that are written, there's 27 books in the New Testament, they're trying to figure out, essentially, how much of the old system applies to this new thing. Easter was sort of this line in the sand. It's a new day. It's a new reality. But in the old system, you weren't allowed to eat certain foods. You couldn't eat pork. That was just part of the law. That was a part of the way. No Phil's barbecue, essentially, was the law. That was the rule. That was the line in the sand. That was one of them. And they're trying to figure out over and over again how much of the old system applies to the new system and this new thing that Jesus has come to do. And so for Peter, for a millennium, the people have been steeped in sacred place, sacred person, sacred practices, and now they get word through Jesus, through Peter, there's a new way that God's going to work. And notice the language that Peter uses when he's articulating the new way that God is going to use the people, the church, to work into the world. 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 4. Is where we'll begin. And if you don't have a Bible, you can follow along on the screens. That's a great place to follow along as well. How we doing, 10 o'clock? You look fantastic. You look fantastic. In case no one's told you that today, you needed to hear that from me. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. You as well. If I ever put on weight, don't tell me that. Don't shout that out. You don't look good today, Jared. It says this, 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 4. As you come to him, this is Peter talking. Now, he's the guy, he's the rock. And this is what he is going to say is the church and how it's supposed to work. He's writing this letter. This is later in his life, around the year 50 or so, 20 or so years after the resurrection. And he says, this is the church, to a handful of churches in Asia Minor. As you come to him, the living stone. Anybody, who's the living stone? Jesus, yeah, that's always the right answer to shout out in church, by the way. In case you're wondering. If somebody ever asks you a question in church, Jesus, yeah, it's Jesus, right? Jesus. It's always a good guess. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, so he gives you the answer, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him. Now notice this language. You also, like living stones. What in the world? You, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house. He says, you are like living stones. Do you think Peter knows what he's doing when he uses this language? We sort of read over that and go, well, that's a nice picture of, what church is, living stones, spiritual house. But this language in a world that is drenched in a system that is about a sacred place, this language is so significant because they understood, certainly the church that's receiving this letter, certainly for Peter, a system that was about a sacred place. Now, if you go to the temple, the ruins, some of us, you've been there, you've seen this in Jerusalem, the temple itself is essentially, this is sort of an up-close picture of what it looks like. It's essentially a bunch of stones stacked on top of other stones. That's the entire infrastructure. It's just stones. In fact, some of these stones, modern day archaeologists aren't even sure how they had the technology to move them into place. They called them the stones of the angels because the belief in the ancient world was that they had angels that literally had carried these stones into place. And so the temple itself, this had taken 46 years to build. It's the most expensive architectural phenomenon in the ancient world. And this particular infrastructure, this particular building, it's just stones stacked on top of other stones. It's just stones that are fitted together. And Peter says, the new model is you are the living stones. This is the image that he gives us of what the church is supposed to be. You're the living stones. You're the temple, that there's not a sacred place and divine real estate. You can't find more divine real estate than yourself today, is essentially what he's saying. You're divine real estate. You're the temple. You are the living stones in your office. When you show up to church, when you're driving down the 15, you are the living stones. And it gets better. Notice what he says. He says, you are like living stones being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. Now, their understanding of priesthood, similar to our understanding of priesthood, there's a sacred person, and that sacred person forgives sins. That sacred person does the sacrifices, does, all the work. And Peter says, no. There's a new system, and there's not just no longer a sacred place. There's not a sacred person either. You're all the sacred people, and you're all the priests. To which we hear that, and some of us, you hear that, you're thinking, you got the wrong guy. You're talking to the wrong person. I am not qualified for that. And he says, even more so than that, he says, you are the ones that offer the spiritual sacrifices. Wait a second, Peter, are you telling me there's not a sacred place and there's not a sacred person, there's not a set of sacred practices? And he says, essentially, he's flipped the script. Jesus Christ himself has flipped the script of what this thing called the church is supposed to be. And you're the sacred place, and you're the sacred person. And the work that you do, that we don't have a system of animal sacrifices anymore, that God is not interested in the work of a person in a place to forgive sins. But the work that you do, whether you show up in the life of a fourth grader or fifth grader, somebody needs to, whether you show up in the life of a millennial as a baby boomer to mentor somebody, whether it's what you give to this church, whether it's what you give to charity, the money that you give, the things that you do, the work that you do to build God's kingdom, you are the priest, and the work that you do is the sacrifice that God says that's sacred. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the church. That's what it's supposed to be. You come to Jesus as the living stone. Well, who died and made him king? He did. Sort of the way it works. You walk out of the tomb, we'll listen to you from now on. But he essentially has set up this system. Who qualifies me to be a priest? Well, it's not me, it's Jesus did. He said he qualifies you to do the work that used to be the work of the priest in a particular place. This system, this is going to have massive implications for churches that begin to understand this. This begins to have massive implications on the ancient world as these communities begin to live this way, that everyone has a role to play, that spiritual work isn't outsourced to an authority, it's everyone together has a role to play. There's a couple different components to it, and we'll just kind of go through this because it's such a massive verse. He says, you're like living stones being built into a spiritual house. That's huge, showing up to church. You're like, I thought I just kind of wandered in here today, man, like a tumbleweed. No, you're like a stone rolling in here, man. You are a living stone. Being built into a spiritual house, which means your presence here today is not by accident. You finding this church and this community is not by accident. And you play in the same way that a stone plays a critical role in building a house, not by itself, but connected to other stones as a part of a church or this church. You play a critical role in this house, in this spiritual house. You are a living stone. In the same way when you see a house, if a stone is missing from it, or part of that, the architecture is missing, there's a vulnerability to it. And the same is true for the church, that your role here and who you are a priest to do spiritual sacrifices to build God's kingdom. You are a critical part. You're the living stones of a spiritual house, which means that church, it's essentially, it's kind of like that game of Tetris. Do you remember Tetris? Played in the arcade or played it on your Game Boy 40 years ago, whenever that was out. But Tetris is where all the rocks sort of fit together. And that's essentially what church is. It's a bunch of living stones kind of bumping up against other living stones. And that God doesn't just take up residence in people, he certainly does, but he takes up residence in a people, that we accomplish more. More gets accomplished in us together. That when we come together as the living stones building the spiritual house, that there's a sacredness to that. That's this thing called the church, Peter. And Peter later in his life begins to articulate it. Living stones, the animated stones, built into a spiritual house. This is the picture. And part of that is that there's a couple different angles to this, but one is when you come to church, most people that come to church or come back to church, this was true for me at 18 years old, when you come back to church for the first time in a long time, and I hear this story almost every week, people come to church or come back to church because they know something in their life needs to change. Somewhere along the way, it was, you were having your first kid and you thought, I need to make some changes if I'm going to bring a kid into this world. It was your first marriage ended and there needs to be a change in your heart and your life. It worked. There was some sort of crisis maybe that you hit and you came to church because you needed to change. And the traditional trajectory in our world is people try to change in isolation. We try to change as a little stone all by ourselves. And I'm going to pray by myself. I'm going to get some good self-help books and read those by myself. All fantastic things to do, but you can never change in isolation. Have you noticed that? It's only as a living stone bumping up against other people in community, and it's awkward at times, but in that process, there's something supernatural that begins to happen when you are connected to other people. And part of the reason is because we all live with a sense that we're broken, that something's not working quite right. Myself, all of us, you have that sense. And you did not get broken on your own. It took a lot of people to help you get messed up, didn't it? You didn't get messed up on your own. Don't give yourself that much credit. It took a lot of people. It was your family of origin played a part. It was your 9th grade boyfriend played a part. It was your first husband's temper played a part. It was a combination of factors. It was your brother that you constantly compared yourself to. A lot of people played. It takes a village to help you get messed up. And in the same way you don't get broken on your own, you don't get put back together on your own. It's fitted together as a living stone, butted up against other parts of the body, other parts of the house of God that you begin to experience. God doesn't just take up residence in people, he takes up residence in a people. So that's a part of it. But there's another side to it. He keeps going in this. I love this. He says, you're like living stones being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood offering spiritual sacrifices. It's not a holy place and a holy person doing holy practices. It is the holy people of God. You are the new priests. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone's been qualified by God, deputized, authorized to do spiritual work, to do spiritual sacrifices, not because of your good behavior, but because of the empty tomb of Christ. You have been qualified for something. You are uniquely qualified because of your story, because of your background, to do something in terms of a spiritual sacrifice. And we never think we're qualified. I don't think I'm qualified to do that. Nobody ever thinks they're qualified. But the scriptures, he say, you're qualified to do something. You're a holy priesthood. Like, I'm not a holy priest, man. If you knew me, if you just had a video of me coming to church this morning, screaming at people in the parking lot, you would know, like, that's not who I am. He says, no, you're qualified to do something. The reason you don't feel qualified to do something, and I don't feel qualified to do something, is because you're constantly comparing yourself to somebody. You know, I'm not qualified to lead a small group. I'm not qualified to help out with a fifth grader. I'm not qualified to, pass out bulletins on a weekend. I'm not qualified to serve. I'm such a mess. I'm so broken. And we all feel that way, by the way. All of us have that sense. I have that sense about myself. I don't feel qualified to do this. We all have that sense because we're always comparing ourselves to somebody. This past week, on Monday, I went to lunch with Dr. Mark Strauss. Some of you know Dr. Strauss. He teaches at the Cove, a phenomenal ministry at CRB, a Bible study that we have every week at this exact time. Some of you know Dr. Strauss. You know who Dr. Strauss is? Good, okay. 4 of you. Dr. Strauss, I'll do a better job of promoting you moving forward. We're having lunch, and he's brilliant. He's so passionate. He's so articulate. He's a seminary professor. He understands the Bible in ways that I just wish, I could understand the Bible. And we're talking about various passages of Scripture. And as he's talking about the Bible, I'm getting inspired and depressed at the same time. You know what I'm talking about? Like, I'm not qualified to do this, man. Like, what am I? Like, I just wanted to, just pack it up, retire. And, I mean, as he talks, I'm listening to him, and I'm like, he's like a theological Pez dispenser, just you want the word, just amazing. So we have friends like that. That's your grandma, like, hey, how you doing? And you don't feel qualified compared to them, but you are qualified. You're uniquely qualified. There is a power inside of you to change somebody's life, and you don't even know you have it. And when you recognize you're the priest deputized by God, that there's not a sacred person. It's not just going to church and listening to what I have to say or Harry has to say or somebody has to say. It's the work of the church. It's the work of the saints. It's the work of the priest that builds the spiritual house. Sometimes people will stop me in the supermarket in the hallway of the church and they'll say, hey, Pastor Jared is a title. And I love that. That's a great thing, and I certainly appreciate that. But there's always something in me, if I'm honest, when people say that, pastor, as a term of endearment, or at least I hope, when people say that, there's always something in me that flinches a little bit. And it's not because I don't like the title, I do. It's just that when you say Pastor Jared, when you say it, I just don't want you to think that that means you're not a pastor. And that's a weird thought, but when you read this, I'm telling you, if you ever stop me in the supermarket, you're like, hey, Pastor Jared, I'm gonna be like, hey, Priest Hannah, how are you today? Because that's essentially what this is saying. You're a holy priesthood, and you offer spiritual sacrifices. We do that together, and that thing called the church, man, that starts firing on all cylinders. Oh my goodness. Communities get transformed. People get transformed in the process. Not just receiving. You come to church and you begin to receive, and there's an input value of listening, and maybe somebody counsels you, but eventually it becomes your hands becoming a part of serving and the sacrifice and doing something to build God's kingdom here. A couple of weeks ago, it was a 15, 16-year-old guy came up to me after one of our services, and he said, I think God's calling me into ministry. And I said, are you a Christian? He says, yeah. I said, well, it's too late for you. You've already been qualified. We all have a role to play. And some of us, you hear that, you're like, man, you've got the wrong guy. You've got the wrong girl. You don't know my story. You don't know my background. I'm telling you, let's just say you're the worst Christian in the building. Let's just say you're the weakest Christian in the building today. Anybody want to volunteer? Anybody? Please do. It's got to be somebody, right? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's me. I don't know. But let's say you're the worst one. You can't get through 5 minutes. I mean, you can't go down to 15 without losing your temper. I mean, say you're the worst, weakest Christian in the building. Say you're the worst Christian in the history of Christianity, okay? It's nobody at the 10 o'clock. That person probably goes to the 11:30, let's be honest. But let's say it's you. Just play along, hypothetical. Do you remember that story? I love this story in Matthew 11 where Jesus is talking to some of the disciples, his disciples, and John the Baptist. He's kind of a rising star in this new upstart movement. And they're looking at John the Baptist and they're looking at Jesus and they're saying, John the Baptist, I mean, he's as high up as it gets. I mean, he baptized Jesus. And Jesus looks at his disciples and he looks at his own disciples. And he says this in Matthew chapter 11. This is so powerful. He says, truly, I tell you, among those born of women, there has never risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Fair enough, he's a big deal. Yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. You come into church today, you're like, man, I'm not qualified to lead a small group. You're more qualified than John the Baptist. I'm not qualified to serve anybody. I'm such a mess. I'm so broken. People can hear me rattle when I walk in the door, man. You're more qualified than John the Baptist. Whoever's least, whoever the weakest one is greater than he. That's you today. And that's me today. And there's not a sacred place. There's not a sacred person, and there's not a sacred set of practices. It's the people, it's the priest doing the sacred work, going into the world as the sacred temples of God. That's the church when it's firing on all cylinders. And Peter and these guys, think of what they saw Jesus model. I mean, I can't imagine. They saw Jesus when he was alive. He was eating and talking with everyone, and nobody was excluded from his presence. No one who has ever walked the face of the earth has been more inclusive than Jesus. In fact, he was getting in trouble all the time because he was essentially saying the old system was about a select few. The old system only let the religious elite, the people of good behavior in. And Jesus was letting people in of terrible reputations, terrible backgrounds, terrible behavior. Jesus was for everyone. Peter saw this modeled. Peter saw modeled that Jesus would eat with anybody. He was doing community with people that were of different economic backgrounds, different ethnicities. He was talking to Samaritan women. He was completely flipping the hierarchy of life on its head. He was just dismantling the caste system of his day. And he was allowing everybody to come into his circle and to be a part of his community. And Peter and the disciples saw this. And perhaps the most powerful thing that Jesus kept doing in his day, in his circle, was that he kept inviting people in and deputizing and authorizing people to do the work of God that previously had been outsourced to priests. And there's people, I mean, you read stories about the Gadarene demoniac who 5 minutes earlier is possessed by demons, and Jesus cleans him up, authorizes and deputizes him and says, hey, you go home and tell people you now have a ministry. And he's giving the work of God away to the people of God. And Peter and the disciples saw this. And when they began to set up the church, this idea that Jesus had on a hillside of Caesarea Philippi 2,000 years ago, when they began to put this into place, they set it up in essentially the way that they saw it modeled. They were saying this Jesus is for everyone. Whoever came into the community, they were invited. Women, children, people from different ages, stages, ethnicities, economic backgrounds. Nobody was excluded from the grace of God in the early church. Everyone was invited in. And when they began to set up communities all throughout the world, whether it's the church at Galatia, whether it's the church at Ephesus, whether it's the church at Jerusalem, what began to transform the world in a world where there were harsh lines drawn between you don't speak to this person and you don't let this person in. The Christian communities began to transform the world because they were inviting everyone to do life together. Different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different economic classes. Everyone was invited into the community. And this began to transform the world. And they saw Jesus model it and they began to live it out. And then, this is really what transformed the world. They began to deputize and authorize everybody to be the priest and to do what Peter says in this verse, that everyone has a role to play. And it was Christians in the first century world. It was Christians in the second century. It was Christians in the early days of the church that began to build hospitals and care for the sick. It was Christians that began to, through spiritual sacrifice, began to educate people. It was Christians that began to be hospitable towards their neighbor. It was Christians that began to act in such a way that they were the priests doing the spiritual work. And this began to transform the world. And it was because when Peter thought about what the church was supposed to be, he just lived out what he had seen Jesus model over and over and over again. And so for him to say, you're the priest doing the spiritual work, of course, because the old model and the old system had gone out of business because of Easter. Last week, we said as a church that there was a new mission statement and a new goal, a sort of new overarching statement for this community and this church. And we said it this way: we want to invite every generation to experience the love and grace of Jesus as lives are made whole, as families are made strong, and as our community is made new. And that's a massive goal. As we think through that, as we prayed through that, saying, okay, that's what we think God is calling us to do. Well, the question is, well, how in the world do you do that? How do you begin to accomplish that? And as we sat down, as we poured over the scriptures and we looked at the life of Jesus, and as we looked at the church that Peter and Paul and these guys began to architect and set up, there were some images for us when it came to their spiritual house that we wanted to be reflected in ours. And one of the statements for us and one of the images that kept popping up over and over again for us as we were talking through this, praying through this, was essentially this idea of the door. Because when you see Christian community in its early days that Peter and Jesus set up in their spiritual house, there was an open door that said Jesus is for everyone. And at the church at Rancho Bernardo, we are a place where nobody's perfect, but everyone is welcome. And nobody is excluded from the grace of God. No story that you ever have had happen. No one's disqualified from the presence of Jesus. And this message begins to transform the world, and we want to be a church that is marked by that marks this community in such a way that says, hey, Jesus is for everyone. Who are we to exclude anybody from our community? And so Jesus is for everyone is one of those images that over and over again for us, it just began to surface because this is a part of our spiritual house. Jesus is for everyone. And as we began to pray through that and think through that, there became another image that began to pop up for us. Because when somebody comes to your house, you don't want them just hanging out at the door. You eventually want to invite them in. That would be kind of awkward if they just stood at your door for hours. You want to invite them in, and you eventually want them to find a place at the table. And so this is another image for us that became central as we began to look and say, okay, what did Jesus model? What did Peter model? What does the church look like? It's marked by an invitation to everyone, and then it's marked by community for everyone, and everyone sits at the table. Everyone has a place at the table. And we mean that in a literal sense, and we mean that in a metaphorical sense, that we want everybody to find community here, not just to hang out at the door, not just to, ask questions about Jesus and experience the grace of Jesus, but more than that, we begin to experience transformation when we find ourselves in community connected to other living stones around the table. And we want that for everyone in our church. When you see Jesus, what is he doing? He's modeling this over and over again. He's eating meals, he's sharing stories, he's doing life with anybody of different economic, different social classes, because that's what the church is supposed to be. A place not just where you come and go to church, but a place where you begin to be the church to one another. And as we began to pray through this, there's this other image that we just kept seeing Jesus use over and over again of what the church is supposed to be. And it's this other image of our spiritual house that began to surface for us, and it's this image of the garden. And it's this idea that everyone has a role to play. Doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what your story is. It doesn't matter. Nobody gets disqualified from being the hands and the feet of Jesus to a city and to a community. Everyone has a role to play. The garden in the house is a place where you get your hands dirty, isn't it? The garden is the place where you plant a seed and you do something that other people are going to benefit from. And when you show up at CRB on a weekend and you come to church and then you go serve in the 4th or 5th grade, what are you doing in the heart of a 4th or 5th grader? You're planting a what? A seed. And we want everyone to find their place as a gardener here, beginning to get their hands dirty and having a role to play, because that's when you begin to experience what the church of Jesus that he dreamed of on a hill in Caesarea Philippi is supposed to be. Whether it's inside the walls of the church, whether it's outside the walls of the church, we want everyone to have a role to play because all of us are priests making spiritual sacrifices through Jesus Christ. That's the picture of a church: the door, the table, and the garden. And that's how we invite every generation to experience the love and the grace of Jesus. We're going to talk more about that, the door, the table, and the garden next week. Please do not miss next week. It's so critical in terms of where we're going. We're going to